Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on creating realistic materials in Blender's Viewport using GLSL shading. And this will probably be a 2 or 3 part series, as there's a lot to cover. And it's kind of a continuation of the last series I did, which was using Blender's game engine for more practical reasons like interior design and architectural visualization. In this series we'll be taking a look at Cycle's materials and seeing which ones we can reproduce in GLSL. And that's for the purpose of viewing models in the viewport and potentially using some of these materials for the game engine as well. And we'll even be taking a look at some of the more complex materials in Cycles and try to reproduce those like anisotropic and translucent shaders. In Cycles, the diffuse shader is used to apply a color or a texture to your model, and alone doesn't really contribute to any of the actual realism of an object or material. It's just the base color or texture. In GLSL material nodes, that diffuse input is indicated here where it says color. Now let's move on to something a little more difficult, like the glossy material. The most important thing to notice here is that at a roughness value of 0, the reflection is very sharp and mirror-like. And also the specularity, or the light reflection here, is very sharp and small. It's very fine and thin detailed around the edges. But if you increase the roughness value, then you see that the reflection becomes very dull, and this light reflection, or the specularity here, becomes much larger and broad on the surface. So in order to create this effect in GLSL, first we need to go to CG Textures and click on this new category, which is HDR Spheres, and then download any texture that you'd like. Now import that into a photo editing software. I'm using GIMP. I'm going to go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'll blur this very high to something like 300. Okay, and I'm pleased with that, so I'll go ahead and export this. And I don't want to overwrite it because I want to keep the original image too. So I'll export as, and then I'll just put in underscore blur after it. And then I can click export. And now I have two images. One is very sharp and the other is very blurry. And we can use these to create a very realistic glossy material in GLSL. And first things first, I'm going to click on New Material and then Use Nodes in the Node Editor. And that also adds the node over here in the Properties window. And then here where the materials are listed, I'm going to select the one that I just created. And now I'll type Shift+A and choose an Input Geometry node. And then type Shift+A again and choose a vector normal node and Shift+A again and converter color ramp. And so now I want to plug the normal value of the geometry node into the normal input and then the dot output into the color ramp. This is actually 3 nodes that we're going to be using a lot in this order for almost every material that we create. And now I'll type Shift+A and add a color mix RGB node. And I'll plug that into the color input on the material node and change the bottom color to black, and then use this color ramp as the mix factor. And it's a little difficult to see what's actually happened with the material, but if we move these colors closer towards the center, so if I drag the black and the white closer to the middle of that color ramp, now it's separated them a bit more, and you can see that the normal node has pushed the white color to the border, or the normal of the object, to the outside, and then the black is closer to the center. And I also like to switch this type to B-spline because it has a bit of a smoother transition. You can try other types to see whatever your preference is, but personally I like the B-spline. And I said earlier we would be using these 3 nodes a lot, and that's because these 3 nodes simulate the Fresnel effect that is very crucial for creating real-world materials. So we'll basically be using this for almost every material that we create in GLSL. Now let's create a space before and after the color ramp. And we'll type Shift+A and add a converter math node. And we'll drop it in between the color ramp and the mix RGB, and we'll set the type to subtract. And if I slide this value down, it will take the white value away from the material. And if I take the value up, it will add white value to the material. So before, where this center was black, now it's gray. And if I increase it even more, it becomes completely white. Okay, so let's just set that value back to 0. And with the math node selected, we will duplicate it with Shift+D. And then just drop that in before the color ramp. Now if I adjust this value, rather than affecting the entire material, it only affects the Fresnel effect in that material. And what I want to do now is find a way to control both of those values together at once. So let me clean these nodes up a little bit by moving them all together. And then I'll type Shift+A and go to Input Value. And now I can use this value node to control both of those math nodes by just plugging it into the second value on each node. And now when I lower this value, it affects both the Fresnel and the overall difference between those two values of black and white. And when I increase it, it of course increases those values. And so this is the method that we're going to use to separate our sharp and rough reflections. So we can actually delete this mix RGB node. And then I'll come over to the properties window and I'll create a new material. And this one I'll call Reflection Sharp. And I'll tab into edit mode and assign the model to it so that we can make our adjustments and see it in real time. And then I'll add a new texture to this material. Then select whatever panoramic image that you plan to use. And by default, that's set to UV coordinates, so you need to scroll down and switch that to reflection. Okay, and you remember when we were analyzing the cycles material, we said that at 0 roughness, it had a very sharp reflection of light. The specularity was very sharp, and currently it looks a little too broad on the surface. So we definitely need to adjust the specularity of this material. So let's go back to the Material tab, and we will switch the type from Cooktour to Blinn. And now I'll take the hardness value up to something like 140, and the IOR value all the way up to 10. And that sharpens that specularity up a little more. Maybe we'll take the hardness up more to 150. And we can increase the specular intensity as well. Okay, that looks a little better. Maybe a hardness of 200. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of literature about what's physically accurate in these materials for Blender Internal or the Blender game engine, so it's kind of a lot of just approximating or kind of guessing, or it's all, I guess, artistic interpretation, really. But let's create a new material now. We'll call this one Reflection Rough, and we'll assign this one as well so that we can see what we're doing. Now let's click on the Texture tab, and we'll add a new texture. And we'll set the coordinates to reflection, just like before. And now I will open the texture that I modified in GIMP. So this will be the blurred texture. Okay, so now let's go back to the Material tab, and we can increase the specular intensity just like we did before. and the hardness value will come down a bit so that that reflection or the specularity is a bit broader on the surface. So okay, maybe like a value of about 40, I guess, could work. So now I'll go back to the original material and I'll assign that and select this material and type Shift+D to duplicate it. And then in the first material slot, I'll select the material, the reflection rough, and the second material will be set to reflection sharp. And if I hold Alt and right click and drag these two materials together, I can combine them with a Mix RGB node. That is, of course, if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. And then I will use this math node as the factor. Okay, so now this one value node should control the roughness of this glossy material. So if I take it up, the glossiness becomes rougher, and if I take it down, it becomes a sharper reflection, which is very cool and very realistic looking. But we still have more to do with this material. So you might want to add a normal map to your model. And so I've actually created one for this model so that you can see how it reacts with the reflection materials. So I'll just go ahead and open that texture and bring it into Blender. And so now I can just type Shift+A and go to Input Texture, and then use this geometry node, and I'll use the UV coordinates and plug it into that texture node. And then something that was previously unavailable is the normal map node, which is in vector normal map. This is something that's relatively new to Blender for Blender internal and the Blender game engine. And from the drop-down menu on the texture node, I can select that normal map texture, and then plug the output of the normal map into the normal input on each material node. Okay, now we've applied our normal map, and as you can see, it actually reacts with the reflection material. So much so that if you actually adjust the strength of the normal map, it affects the reflection in a very obvious way. So I can set mine to a value of maybe 0.5, and I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so our reflection material is pretty much finished, except for one thing, and that's if you're using a 100% glossy reflective material, it's probably metal. And in that instance, you would want to be able to change the color of the material. So, you know, for the purpose of distinguishing between copper, gold, silver, so on. So let's customize this so that we can change the color of the material. And this is really easy to do. We'll just move all of this to one side. And then we will come over to our materials and we'll create a new material. And this one I will just call color. Okay, and then we will make this shadeless because it won't need to react to the lighting at all. And now we'll duplicate this material with Shift+D, and we'll just open that color material from the drop-down box. And so now I want to mix this material with the nodes that we have created before this, so all of the the nodes that made up the glossy material is going to be mixed with this color material. So we'll just duplicate this mix RGB node and plug this material into the second input and switch the mix type to color and take the factor all the way up. And so now it's as simple as just changing the color of this color material to actually change the color of whatever metal you're trying to simulate. And if you're interested, here are the precise values of different metal types if you're interested in getting the accurate colors. But here I'm just kind of guessing. Okay, so our glossy material is finished, so we can just box select everything with B, except for the output node, and type Control G, which turns this into a node group. And now we can select what kind of inputs and outputs we want. So one thing I know we want is to be able to customize the color, so we'll plug the color from the color material into one of those inputs. And that's already named color, so that's fine. And now we want to be able to customize the roughness, which is controlled by this value node. So instead of using this value node, we're going to do something a little different. We'll just disconnect this, and we can actually just delete it. And so now I can plug this first math node into the group input, which creates a new input in this material node. And if I hold Shift and left click and drag that through, I can create a rerouter, which I can plug into the second math node. And now from the material node, I'll be able to control both of those values at once. So let's just rename that input to roughness. Okay, so if we press tab, we can go back out of edit mode, and we can see that we now are able to change the color of the material and the roughness of the material. And this is what I love so much about node groups, is that you can take this really complicated node web and just use the inputs and values that you need. So I can really quickly just change the color of this material, and then I can change the roughness, which will affect the sharpness or the roughness of the reflection, and also the specularity, just with one value slider. So it's pretty amazing. There's one more thing that I want to add to this, though, is the strength of the normal map. So I can just plug the strength right into the group input node, and then I can just change the name of this to normal strength. And if I tab out of this, then now I can see that this value slider will affect the normal map as well. Okay, so we've created our glossy material. We have this perfectly functioning material now that works as a glossy shader, but what if we want to mix this with a diffuse material to create like a plastic or ceramic type material? So in that instance, well, let's begin by creating a new material, and we'll call it diffuse. And then to mix this with a glossy material, it's really quite easy because we've already done all of the work anyway. We'll just type Shift-A and go to Input and Material, and we will select that diffuse material that we just created. And now, once again, if you have Node Wrangler enabled in the add-ons, you can hold Alt and right-click and drag those nodes together and connect them with a Mix RGB node. And now I'll type Shift-A and go to Input Geometry node. and then Shift+A vector normal node, and use the normal output into the normal input on the normal node. And make a little more space. And then type Shift+A and go to converter color ramp. And I put a lot of emphasis on this in the beginning, how often we would be using these nodes. So we want to use the dot output of the normal node into the input on the color ramp. Okay, so now we can use the color of the color ramp as the factor of the mix RGB. And we can give the diffuse material a color. For this example, I'll just use blue. But it's backwards, so we want to click this little arrow tab, which will reverse the color ramp. And now the reflection is on the outside, and the color, the diffuse color is on the inside, which is how we want this material to look. And we can use the color ramp to customize that Fresnel effect. And now if I type Shift+A, I can go to Input Texture and use the UV coordinates from the Geometry node. And once again, select that normal map texture. And type Shift+A and go to Vector Normal Map. Plug the color into the normal map and the normal output into the normal input on the diffuse material. And I'll set this normal map strength to 0.3 as well, so that it matches the normal value on the glossy material. And I can adjust this color ramp to get a better index of refraction or Fresnel effect that I like better. So I think that looks pretty good. I might want to change the type to B-spline like I did before, because that again has a very like a bit of a smoother transition between those two values of black and white. But I think overall it looks pretty good. And we've gone from creating a glossy shader that's 100% glossy, like a metal material, and we have mixed that with some diffuse materials to create what could be a plastic or ceramic material. And it's pretty convincing, I think, for the viewport. And so I think that's probably it for this video. In the next one, we will try to simulate some more of Cycle's materials, and even how to mix some of those materials into more complicated shaders for, GLSL. So until then, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.